Thank you very much, Jeremy, and welcome everyone. We have a great topic to discuss today with a fantastic panel, which I will introduce very shortly, starting with Nathalie Loiseau, member of the European Parliament and a former Minister for European Affairs in France. Next to her, Alexander Stubb, the director of the School for Transnational Governance at the European University Institute, which is my alma mater. Previously Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Finland and member of both Finnish and European Parliament previously. Next to him, Alex Soros, the chair of the Open Society Foundations with a PhD in history. Alex follows politics closely just about everywhere, but particularly in the US, which he's here to talk about today. And last but not least, Alex Velez-Green, former National Security Advisor to Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, whom you've just seen on Jeremy's slide. Alex is one of the most outspoken voices, similarly to his former boss, on the need to refocus resources towards Taiwan to deter Chinese aggression, which they see as imminent as soon as 2027. And has recently co-authored with Bridge Colby in the Washington Post, arguing that there's a direct cannibalization between the US assistance to Ukraine and to Taiwan. So welcome, Alex, and Nathalie. Nathalie, should you feel left out, I'm happy to call you Alexandra for the rest of the panel.
Alex can also be a girl's name.
Alex, whichever one you choose. But I do have one ask of my three Alexes here. Please do not respond until you hear your full name called. Otherwise, I will have a complete confusion. So because we're going to have each time repeating your full name, do forgive me if we go 3 minutes over the panel. Alex Velez-Green, I'm going to start with you. Could we just kind of jump straight into the Republican primaries? We have, an increasingly crowded field with at least 10 or 12 contenders for the Republican presidential nomination, and two frontrunners are quite different from the rest of them that we could put in the prime assist category, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. Now, could you just tell us, who do we need to watch? What are their kind of key foreign policy ideas? And what is the most consequential foreign policy shift in the US should a Republican candidate win a presidency in 2024, especially from the European point of view?
Sure, absolutely. Maya, thank you so much for the invitation, the opportunity to speak here and be a part of this, and for your team putting this together. I would echo what, I don't know quite where Jeremy went off to, but hello. But I would echo, frankly, a lot of the analysis that was described up there in the previous presentation. The front runners are clearly Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. We can argue whether or not Trump is more of a restrainer or a prioritizer, given I think the very useful framework that you all have put together. I think DeSantis, based on his remarks and some other things thus far, it fits more clearly in the prioritizer camp. And I think that gives you a sense of where the base is going. Both of those candidates are extremely responsive to Republican voters. And so those are useful data points. I'd also offer that they are not alone. There are a growing number of folks, especially in the House, but also in the Senate, who are arguing, again, for more of a prioritizer approach to foreign policy, a more realistic and focused foreign policy. And that's true, too, as well as in the institutional landscape. We saw Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation has written, arguing explicitly to focus more on Asia and shifting resources away from Europe. He's done it on his own. He's done it with Bridge Colby. And so this is a movement that I would submit has both depth and increasingly breadth and power at the elite levels. Now, this is I would say important, one, because it sort of tells you where, or it gives you a good sense, I think, of where the Republican Party is headed as we head into this presidential cycle, both as the campaigns continue and as things materialize, if there is a next Republican president.
So could you describe, just in a nutshell, what is it that the prioritizers actually thinks need to be done and 100%. How that affects Europe?
I think the crux, put bluntly, is the next Republican president is going to need to prioritize China. I mean, there's no country or non-state actor, for that matter, poses the same kind or magnitude of threat to American interests as China. And so denying China's bid for regional hegemony in Asia, in particular, is going to need to be the organizing principle of that administration's foreign policy. And that, most urgently means we have to strengthen deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. It means building out our own deterrent posture. It means arming Taiwan as quickly as possible. And these are things that, unfortunately, we just cannot do while maintaining the kinds of high levels of investment that we've maintained thus far in other theaters, particularly Europe. So to sort of put a bow on it, that means that we're going to need to rely much more heavily on our NATO allies. And this is going to be a core task and priority for the next Republican administration. Getting to a place where Europeans are primarily responsible for Europe's conventional defense, relying on the United States for our extended nuclear deterrent, and those conventional forces we can provide without detracting from our ability to deter China. This is something that, I think this is starting to penetrate some of the discussions here in Europe, just based on my conversations with officials from various countries. But this is an urgent issue, and we've talked about this a little bit as well. War in the Pacific is a very real possibility in the very near future, and if that happens, many of the things that Europe has typically expected from the United States to defend forward, particularly in the Baltics and Poland and like this, they simply will not be available. And so this is the world we live in. That's the world the next Republican president will inherit. And this is the kind of strategic approach, the kind of ruthless prioritization that will be required to deal with it. And fortunately, Republican politics lend to that kind of approach. So that is hopefully in a concise way where the primaries seem to be headed, and the substance of what that means for us strategically and for Europe.
And just a last follow-up question, what would that specifically mean for Ukraine? Would you expect the U.S. president, if he turns to be a prioritizer or surrounded by such advisors, to simply abandon Ukraine from one day to another? Or would you expect a next GOP president to try and make a quick deal, so to then shift the resources?
I think abandon is a strong word. I mean, I think in the prioritization camp, there's oftentimes a recognition that the United States does have an interest in Ukraine that is not dominated by Russia, right? Even if only to provide a territorial buffer between Eastern NATO and Russia. I mean, there is an interest there. However, if you're stacking it, it pales in comparison to the priority interest we have in the Indo-Pacific. And so given limited resources, then you have to allocate accordingly. I would expect at a minimum a substantial reduction in the kind of U.S. aid that's been sent to Ukraine thus far. And that's going to have material effects up until the point that Europe can backfill. Ukraine has only been able to sustain the offensive that we've seen, the counteroffensive we're about to see or maybe seeing, primarily because of the large amounts of aid that the United States has delivered. If that goes away, if that's substantially reduced, then you can sort of anticipate what that means for the battlefield. As far as a settlement or something else, that's very much TBD, and nobody really knows. But that is, I think, in broad strokes at least, what you could expect for Ukraine.
Thank you. Going next to Alex Soros. If a 82-year-old Biden wins in 2024, will the alliance, the Transatlantic alliance, feel powerful and robust with continued U.S. leadership on Ukraine? Or do you expect some cracks in the alliance as well? Will the administration also feel kind of pushed to refocus the resources on Taiwan? Can you tell us what is at stake in 2024 general elections for foreign policy?
Yeah, I just, as somebody that just thinks a lot about World War II, I just don't buy this idea that, you can't fight on something on two fronts, even though we're not even at war in Ukraine. And I'm not sure we're going to war with China besides our rhetoric in Capitol Hill, because I don't know of many U.S. congressmen that want any U.S. soldiers to be dying from their district, coming back in body bags, dying for a country that most Americans, or for a thing we don't even call a country, for Taiwan, a place where most of them don't even know. I think that's a Capitol Hill debate, as I said, I think I believe in the ability of the U.S. to fight on multiple fronts. It's done it many times in the past, and it's mustered up the means, and it's shaped just ask Japan and Germany. But as I said, right, we're not at war. We're not at war with Ukraine. I expect there to be continuity and opportunity. I think that America and the Biden administration will show that both it and the Democratic Party are a reliable partner. I hate to disagree with my dear friend Jeremy, but I disagree with this a lot of what he laid out, both because it's just not what the voter file shows, and it's whether Chris Murphy is a realist or not, or whether Jake Sullivan is a realist or not, or where the progressives are. I think that I haven't seen one progressive vote go against Ukraine. So I don't see much division in the Democratic Party on Europe and the transatlantic relationship. I think there's broad support for lethal aid toward Ukraine, from Ocasio-Cortez to Joe Manchin. I think it'll be harder to explain to the American voter why we're paying for schools in Ukraine during the rebuild than it will be to fight for the war, because it's an easier sell to point to a country defending itself than if you're going to say American kids. And I know that this is a fear of some people. Going forward. But I think that one of the reasons there is so much unity in the Democratic Party, and I say this, and I'm going to be a bit sentimental, so forgive me, I'm just in that mood, and among so many friends, but I remember sitting on moderating a panel in 2019. Jake Sullivan, I was in your seat, it was in Lisbon, Jake Sullivan was here, Amanda Sloat was here, you all know what they're doing. And now talking about what a future Biden presidency, a future Democratic presidency would look like, because at that point we didn't know who the front runner was. It could have been Bernie Sanders, and this was part of we were all part of a project to forge consensus in the Democratic Party. And I can't tell you the amount of times that, and it may just be flattery, but it has to do with ECFR, that I hear from those folks that project, and also the ability to engage with ECFR when we had, informally and created these networks, really helped restore the transatlantic relationship. And thanks also to the polling, which Carl doesn't like, but they found it useful. Really felt that it prepared them to be able to unite Europe around Ukraine, because they learned how to speak to Europeans. So I just want to say that I think people at ECFR, and I know the goal of ECFR was to get Europe that could be able to respond to a challenge like this. I mean, we should be proud that we succeeded in that mission. And I think that ECFR also provided and was a catalyst for this unprecedented unity, which, if the day the invasion started, I wouldn't believe you would still have this going on right now. And if you guys can do that with Republicans, I encourage you to do that. I'm not sure if that's possible, because I think Donald Trump has made it clear he's more interested in civil war in the U.S. than anything, and we'll call Putin, and sell Ukraine the first thing he does when he gets elected. It's very clear that he's the front runner in the race, is the candidate basically, but I urge you to try, because I think it's a vital interest of the United States and Europe to mitigate any damage to this relationship, and to the partnership that has been forged over decades.
Thanks, Alex. This is a really good segue to Natalie. Sorry, I'm going to skip you, Alex, for a second.
Too many Alexes, sorry.
Just to get a break from Alex's, and we'll come back to you. Natalie, I've heard basically what I've heard from Alex Velez-Green was we are about to, if we have a Republican presidency, we are going to have a ruthless and rapid shift of resources and deprioritization of Europe and full focus on Taiwan and Asia. What I've heard from Alex Soros is we're going to have, in a case of the second Biden term, more continuity. But as we have shown in our paper, and Jeremy has mentioned in the presentation, part of that continuity is also some of the policy issues where the parties converge, where Europeans are going to need to pick up the pieces in the Middle East and North Africa, withdrawal from Afghanistan without consulting allies, AUKUS decision, strategic industrial policy and trade, IRA. So how do we hedge as Europeans? How do we prepare for both scenarios, either a ruthless shift or more continuity that is going to have implications for Europe as well?
Well, thank you for these very relevant questions, and I have good news for the two American Alexes, and this is that we listen to you and we hear you. 3 presidents, American presidents in a row, have told us that Asia was more important. Yeah. And that we should share more of the burden of European security. This is nothing new.
Okay.
And finally, we are starting to act. What European defense is about is paying more for defense budgets, finally acknowledging that at least 2% of GDP is a reasonable cost for doing what we have to do. And on Ukraine, one of the miscalculations of Putin was unity of the West, but also commitment and resolve of European Union. So we have listened to you, and I remember vividly a trip to Washington in September or October 2021, where everybody from the NSC to the State Department or the Pentagon was telling me, well, what's important is China. And I was the one talking about these guys from Russian military gathering at the Ukrainian border. So there is what you say, what you foresee, and then there is what you have to do. I'm certain that the Biden administration didn't have in mind that there would be a war in Ukraine until they warned us, and didn't have in mind that there was such a need for Western support. And finally, they decided to have this significant support. We decided the same just because we had to do it, not only for Ukraine, not only for European security, but for Western leadership and relevance. And I'm certain that the road to what we have to do in Taiwan goes through the victory of Ukraine in the war, in the Russian war of aggression. Let's face it, we have a problem of leadership, and it's a collective West we, because we left Afghanistan, because Iraq was left in chaos, because Obama's red lines in Syria were not followed by action. And the world was watching, and the world is still watching, and the world will be on the side of the winners of the war in Ukraine. And China is watching. Authoritative states are watching whether we, what used to be called the free world, are in a situation to support and defend democracies when they are attacked. And if the answer is yes, it will have consequences for Taiwan and for Asia. If the answer is no, if the United States are not seen as a reliable ally, the one that stays the course, it will have a cost for all of us. So indeed, and you're right to underline that, we have to cope with this foreign policy for the middle class, with this America first, which was stated by Trump, but still is, in a way, Biden's policy. And I would say yes, and we do Europe first as well. and don't blame us about it. Of course, what we owe to our voters, and I'm a parliamentarian, so I have to be focused on this, is to protect our interests. Our interests are with a strong alliance with the United States, but are also with strategic autonomy and with getting rid of our dependencies.
Okay, so I'm going to, I wanted to ask you just to elaborate a little bit as to how the French vision of the European strategic autonomy, if you could just in 2 minutes, because it does differ from Finland's, and I, will then pass it to Alex to give us his view. But how do you see it right now? I mean, the US has returned to Europe and is leading again on Ukraine, so is it still relevant given the threats on the horizon? Do we actually need to think about a more independent European foreign policy, which is not only about building up capabilities, but actually having agency and independence in decision making? So just very briefly, please.
I think that it's less different in practice than it is in theory. More and more this debate about strategic autonomy versus transatlantic alliance has turned into something very different. In reality, there are question marks. If tomorrow we have an unexpected crisis, we talked about Western Balkans recently, or Southern Mediterranean, it might not be of interest from the United States, and we will have to act. Very simply, we had to evacuate our nationals from Khartoum, and we were able to do it without American assistance, whereas in Kabul it was not possible. So these are very basic things on which we have to act. And it also means that we are becoming a more relevant and a stronger European pillar of NATO at the same time. We can do it both with this principle of single set of forces. It's not contradictory. We want to be strong members of the alliance. And for example, right now at the eastern flank of NATO, what is the framework nation in Romania? This is France. These very annoying, always critical French people who had said that NATO was brand aid and this sort of things. Well, they talk a lot, but the way they act is very different, and they are very present.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you've just already presented partly Finnish position, I would think, by talking about the European strategic sovereignty, maybe more in the framework of NATO. Alex, if I turn to you, Alex Stubb, if I turn to you, and if I remind you of Alex Welle's Green's boss, who was the only senator in the US Senate to vote against Finland's NATO membership, who is a prioritizer.
I'm leaving.
I do not want to put you on the spot, Alex. I am just pointing out that if we do get a prioritizer US president or influenced, we do have some issue with their commitment to the expansion of NATO, and you may want to comment on that, to the defense generally of the alliance. So I want to ask you, keeping in mind that possibility, are you worried? How do you see, what does then to you European strategic sovereignty, autonomy, however you want to call mean, and what do you think we need to do to hedge?
Yeah, sure. I mean, probably to ease the debate, we have Alex the Republican, Alex the Democrat, and Alex the Moderate. I think that's my role, yes. I'll try to bring it. I mean, I guess the starting point and the lesson that I've taken from Finland to a certain extent is that you always have to prepare for the worst. And if you look at, Finnish foreign and security policy was always a combination of idealism and realism. And idealism was the idea that bona fide, for instance, we wanted to cooperate with Russia. Realism was that at the same time, we had 900,000 men and women in reserves. We had 280,000 that we can mobilize at wartime. We bought 62 F-18s, now purchased another 64 F-35s. We have one of the most sophisticated land-to-air defense mechanisms in NATO. And we didn't exactly do that because we were worried about what Carl in Stockholm was going to do, right? So I think to a certain extent, I'm a bit torn between the two. I'm not a big fan of the term of strategic autonomy. or strategic sovereignty, because to a certain extent, I think a lot of us in the Nordics, rightly or wrongly, see it as not Europe first, but France first. And that's the problem. And quite often it is, I mean, to be very honest, quite often it's about who says it and what's done. So for instance, I take Macron's visit to Beijing lately. He was probably saying the right things, but he was not the right person to say it. So we're going to have to play with this. And I think, we managed the Trump era fairly well, but I think one of the arguments that your paper with Shapiro and others make a claim is that we still have to prepare for the possible fact, that we get a Republican president who is willing to try to end the war in Ukraine immediately, who will start withdrawing his support for the war, and might even get quite bullish with Taiwan. So, keep on working on something ourselves. Final point on this, I'm pro-European, pro-American, and therefore by definition pro-transatlantic. I don't like the language of us detaching ourselves from American security. I think, the global West is basically 50 countries, 40 plus of them in Europe, US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. And we have a value connection. And that value connection comes also with a security connection. And I don't think we should decouple that in any which way. Final point on this is that there's nothing that unites you more than a common enemy. And right now, it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, Russia is an enemy. And then the question is, how do you mitigate the rivalry between China? So it's a complex situation, but in Europe, we have to prepare for it.
Thank you. May I just do one follow-up? I mean, you've just laid out really a case of impressive military posture and readiness of Finland, both in terms of...
That's why I think the senator should have voted for us. I was just trying to make the case there. Come on, we're giving you.
So Alex, are you convinced, or was it your advice? I mean, what can we expect with this, potential Republican administration if you're an advisor and then, on national security?
No, normally we're kind to here in Europe. Don't worry.
Well,
be blunt. I mean, I want you
Sure.
to disagree a little bit here.
Well, I won't speak too much about past decisions or potential future advice specifically. However, I think what one of the other Alexes just said, which I think is really prescient, is prepare for the worst. And this is in substantial part, and it's been the focus of this discussion in large measure so far, a matter of politics. And so where are the politics of national security going within the Republican Party? But it's also, and I think even more fundamentally, a factor of structural trends within the international system. China is rising. The United States has limited resources. This imposes trade-offs. I know many folks who believe or take as an article of faith that the United States can do it all everywhere. It's just not true. It's just not true. There's, for those of you with military experience who participate in defense planning, you may be familiar with the phrase, the simultaneity problem, as reflected in a force planning construct. Basically, this is something that the Trump administration and now the Biden administration have both publicly validated. The United States military, the joint force, cannot fight and win wars with China and Russia at the same time or in close sequence to one another. It's just not possible. If the flag goes up in Asia, bombers, submarines, airlift, sea lift, certain ISR, advanced munitions, these things will be required to win that campaign over Taiwan. These are also things that are required to defend forward in the Baltics, for instance. And so if they are allocated in Asia, you have gaps. Europe has a problem. If the flag doesn't go up in Asia, if for whatever reason there's a conflict in NATO's eastern reaches first, these same things are still required in both places. So what does that mean? It means if we allocate them to Europe, they are not available for Asia. And depending on where our defense industry is, they may not be available for a while. And so long as Asia then is our priority, then some of these things cannot be sent to Europe without sacrificing that priority interest. Europe, again, has a problem. So that's the simultaneity problem. This is not a matter of political rhetoric. This is something that, again, is reflected in multiple defense strategies, been validated publicly by many senior officials. Democrats in the administration, outside the administration, who are fluent in these issues, recognize it and talk openly about it. This is not a secret. This is reality. So this is the framework within which any prioritizer advisor, or prioritizer president will need to operate.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So just to kind of, because I want to leave enough time for Q&A, we still have a little bit of time for discussion, but I want to throw in two more thoughts, given what we keep hearing in terms of a potential Republican scenario, given what you have said in terms of our hedging strategy, and especially, Alex, on Finland's military readiness. I wonder, and I'm going to introduce one additional uncertainty. I mean, we've talked about Middle East, North Africa, the talks in Jeddah collapsed last week on Sudan, and the Americans the Americans sent John Godfrey, who is a great ambassador, but that was the level. And so the military just left, and it's one of the kind of indicators that America is withdrawing from other regions. And if I just look at the Western Balkans, which Jeremy forbade me to talk about, but since you're all mentioning it, I will give you an additional source of worry. The secessionist leaders, and specifically Milorad Dodik in the Western Balkans, is openly saying that he is waiting for the second Trump term to go ahead with secession from Bosnia. If we do have that, we might have another war in the Balkans. And so when I think about the, agency, strategy, capabilities of the EU, even for 3.5 million Bosnia, I don't see it in place. We have had 60,000 troops, American troops, stationed in Bosnia after the war. Currently, we have 1,000 EUFOR soldiers that are mostly composed out of Austrian, Hungarian, Turkish soldiers. I'd love to see some Finnish soldiers out of this.
KFOR was,
so how can we replicate, how can we actually really replicate your model, which is obviously very, very focused on self-defense, to a European level?
Well, I think the first thing we need to understand is actually to come back to Tim's point. I think enlargement took a completely different turn after the war in Ukraine began. It became probably the most pressing security political issue after Ukraine, and at the same time, the most pressing and important foreign policy issue for the European Union. If we really want to talk about strategic autonomy, then that should be about enlargement. By the way, I think that in the next Commission, probably one of the most important portfolios is that one on enlargement. Basically because we're looking at a Europe divided into two, if not for a century, at least for decades. And that means that we need to get our own house in order. And I think this has shifted a lot of political leadership in Europe as well. There was that sentiment that never the Western Balkans. Well, Miro Lajčák, who's roaming somewhere around here, he knows how super important it is. There's absolutely no way in which we can legitimately continue the process of European integration and union without solving the Western Balkans issue. So this is our, what I would say, internal cuisine, and this is where the real strategic autonomy comes in. May I just finish on one point with word games with strategic autonomy? I think what happens quite easily is that we talk about strategic autonomy, but if there is not strategic unity on something like enlargement, then it becomes strategic cacophony, and that's when we look very weak.
Yep. And I fear currently I see a lot of that cacophony.
Well, I to a certain extent, yes, but less so than before.
Well,
much less so than before, because this notion of enlargement, which was really radioactive.
Yeah.
For years, if not decades, there was this enlargement fatigue. After 2004, we had thought we had done so much. Yeah. Now it's back in the discussion. And the pretexts we had before, saying that we had to review our own internal governance before getting bigger, has changed because thanks to Ukraine. Because when people are dying because they want to become members of the European Union, they are not dying because of NATO. They are still waving EU flags. It makes a whole difference. And now it's more, how do we make it? And how do we succeed rather than better never? So it's not going to be easy, but, and I fully agree with you that we should pay much more attention to the next commissioner on enlargement than what we've done in the current European Commission. But I think that we are getting ready. We should also start getting proud, because where else in the world do other nations want to join a political project like countries willing to join the European Union? Let's stop thinking, oh, it's complex, it's difficult. Oh, these guys in Western Balkans, they keep on fighting. Well, let's engage like Miroslav Lajčák is doing. Let's be present. Let's embrace it as a chance to be stronger because we are bigger. And let's stop being so European that we always see the gray part of it.
Okay. My last question before we open for the Q&A, I want to ask you all one quick response on what worries you most about the second Trump term. And it's different questions to all of you. So maybe Alex, very briefly, if I start, Alex Soros, very briefly, if I start with you. Yeah. Do you worry about the Western Balkans in case Trump returns with Grunel as the Secretary of State, who seems very obsessed with the region, or do you worry about something else?
I worry about America. I'm sorry. It's, as I said, I mean, you know, Trump has made it clear the war that he wants to fight.
Okay, thank you. Alex Velez-Green. Luca did a great introduction about Denmark at the very beginning. Here she is. One thing that occurred to me is that Trump at one point is the guy who tried to purchase Greenland from Denmark and was very offended when that did not happen and canceled his visit and his visit to the Queen. Now, when I talk to some of the high-ranking members of the first Trump administration who worked on the region, Indo-Pacific, they worry about Trump's commitment to the defense of Taiwan and jokingly sometimes say he's more likely to try to purchase Taiwan rather than defend it and deter Chinese invasion. So, do you worry about that?
Honestly, it's a great question. I don't know where Trump would go on it, and for that matter, I don't know where DeSantis or anyone else would go on it. If it is true that Trump is the president and elects not to defend Taiwan, what I would say only is it doesn't make any of the problems that I've described here easier. At that point, it becomes harder and more costly for the United States to balance against China in the first island chain, which only accentuates many of the pressures that are already driving us to reallocate resources away from Europe. So I would just say, it is entirely possible, I don't know about a purchase, but that a second-term President Trump will elect not to defend Taiwan, but that does not make things any easier, so far as I can tell, in Asia or in Europe.
And maybe potentially to kind of trade it for a better trade deal with China, to kind of use it as a bargaining chip for a trade deal with China. Whichever scenario, but Natalie, would that bring kind of the U.S. policy a bit closer to the French middle way, or am I going all the way wrong here?
You know, once again, it's not really the French middle way. You've seen the polling at the start of our meeting. It's more a European, short-sighted way of saying, well, as long as we don't have imminent threat, let's keep on trading and we're fine. I disagree personally with that. I think we should learn the lessons from our dependency on Russian cheap energy. We were dependent on Russian cheap energy. We are still dependent on a Chinese supply chain, and we are outsourcing our security to the United States. And I don't think neither of the three is reasonable. So I think we should be able not to decouple, because not even the United States is decoupling. De-risking, of course, and if you ask people in the streets what the risking is about, of course they don't get it. But at least having different suppliers and being able to relocate what we can relocate. Remember, there was a lot of talk about Macron's interview after his visit to Beijing. But first, he went to Beijing with Ursula von der Leyen. So he keeps in mind, because he had done it before welcoming Xi Jinping in Paris with Jean-Claude Juncker at the time, that it's better to deal with China at a European level than at a national level. And second, the only European warship which was sailing in the Taiwan Strait during the Macron's visit was a French warship. So there are the words, but there are the deeds. And we have been pushing for strategic control of foreign investment in strategic sectors in Europe. We have been pushing for anti-coercion mechanisms. We strongly believe that we should pay more attention to this. Unfortunately, a number of Europeans are still only thinking about very short-term profits without realizing that they are getting more and more dependent. And as far as I see it, and I've been studying Chinese for civilization and language and everything for decades, what I see from China now is that they don't really want to cooperate. They want to replace us. And that worries me.
Would you say that view is shared by President Macron?
I think he's very aware of the situation, but we also realize that we cannot do as if there was no China. We cannot do as if China was as weak as Russia is. We have to find ways to engage, but we have to better protect ourselves from rivalries that we see rising.
Alex Stubb, do you want to say something, or can I ask a question first?
You can ask a question first, as long as it's a really good and nice question. Yeah.
Absolutely. Trump's second term, which one is bigger worry of yours as a former Prime Minister of Finland on NATO and commitment to defense and security of NATO allies, i.e. Finland, in case we need to work with more than just Ukraine? Or there's my favorite song by Leonard Cohen called The Future. And there's a line in that song which says, there will be a breakdown of the ancient Western code. My private life would suddenly explode. As the director of a Center for Transnational Governance, are you worried about what's going to happen to the international rule-based order if Trump is reelected, and commitment to the institutions? And
I think we have to understand that the international rules-based liberal world order and the institutions that have supported it since World War II, including the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, they are right now in turmoil and in change. I think we're living in our 1919, 1945 or 1989 moment. And at the end of the day, it means that there will be some kind of a new order. I think it'll probably take a decade with or without Trump. I agree with Alex Democrat that the biggest issue is going to be polarization in the United States itself, because I think American withdrawal from the world stage has already been happening for a long time. I'd say sort of it started after the war in Georgia in 2008, and whenever there's a power vacuum that emerges, someone is going to try to fill it. My big thesis in the book that I'm working on the New World Disorder, is to say that we will probably have multiple orders, which are regional, and then overarching alliances. A final point on this, the big difference from 1989 is that in 1989, and this was Leah and many other talks, there was this element of hope, you know? And there was this idea that we defeated communism and socialism, and we defeated the state. And everything was about market, market, market. The European Union was about 4 freedoms, it was about trade policy, it was about competition policy. But now I would argue that the interventionists are winning this game. And the pendulum started to swing from market to state already, I think, after 9/11. And now we're hopefully starting to see the peak of it. And if I may, I'm simplifying completely. I think perhaps French interventionism or dirigism is winning the day, not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world in terms of breaking down value chains and bringing them home closer to roost. And I think this is the big sort of economic debate that we're going to have in the next decade as well.
Thank you. How are we doing the Q&A? Or is there a microphone? I see a couple of hands here. Asla, the gentleman 2 rows behind, Wolfgang Ischinger, and my new friend, whose name I forgot, from the EUI, your deputy. So, yeah, why don't we start? And please keep them short. We have 15 minutes left.
Okay. Okay, nice working. Leszek Kaczewski, Liberta, an Oxford University. Very short question to American and European panel. 2 different questions. To American panel, do you think what worked that Trump was contained in a way that he couldn't really apply his, especially Russia anti-NATO policy? There were more American troops in Poland and Eastern Europe actually than under Trump than anywhere, any time before. To European panel, how do you imagine the real post-American Europe? And I think maybe this sort of question would realign Western and Eastern Europeans, because Eastern Europeans want to pay a high price for keeping Americans in, and French maybe want to prepare Europe for the moment when Americans are not anymore in Europe. And if you drop the term autonomy, but keep strategic, and replace autonomy with caution, maybe both sides actually would say, yeah, that's quite a smart policy to do. Thank you.
Okay, Asla?
Hi, my question is for Alex Velez, Green. What is wrong with one China policy that seems to have kept relative stability? After living in Washington for almost a year now, it's hard not to feel concerned that our response to the China challenge is not solely economic, but so militarized that it's creating its own dynamic. Yes, it's the case that China is the only country, only global power with the intent and the means to be a global competitor, near competitor to US, et cetera, but there's no real indication, and I'm saying this based on testimony by senior US officials in Congress, there's no real indication that they're planning to go to war with the West. Isn't this creating its own dynamic? And what's wrong with one China policy that has worked so far?
Okay, could we take Wolfgang Ischinger as the third?
Thanks, great discussion. A question with 2 parts. First part, I'd like to challenge the Ukraine-Taiwan nexus here, and I would present the following claim. The best way for the United States to encourage China to aggressively tackle the Taiwan issue is for the United States to withdraw from Ukraine.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And the best way to discourage and deter China from thinking about aggressing Taiwan is to stay here, to continue defending the freedom, the et cetera, of Ukraine. That's the first part of my question. Be interested in the reaction. Second part of my question is a reference to Jeremy's presentation, where he pointed out, I think correctly, that there is one part of the US electorate that looks at Europe as free riders, and another part of the US electorate that looks at Europe as a possible or potential or real asset. So my question to the panelists, is there anything Europe can do to make the American voter believe that we're dealing with assets rather than freeloaders?
Good question. Should we, I think we can take this and then we'll go to the fourth one. So who wants to start? There was, the first question went first to the Americans, then to the Europeans. Do you want to address it? Alex Soros?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is misleading. Americans don't vote very much on foreign policy. If that was the case, John Kerry would have been president. I mean, and I don't think foreign policy is going to figure very much into this campaign at all, if there's even an ad on it. I mean, maybe, attacking Ukraine from Trump, but this is not what this election is going to be fought over. Majority of Americans don't even dislike China. They dislike their jobs, and dislike globalization. And there's a lot of data showing post NAFTA, the way that American workers see globalization. So I don't think there's an anti-European bias in the electorate that has constituency. I think there's a larger discussion going on in the United States about trade. We no longer believe in free trade. That's pretty clear. We are engaging in national industrial policy, and I think that makes it very hard to say that China is also misbehaving, because there's obviously things that we're going to be willing to do in the name of this vacuum we have now, that the neoliberal order is dead, so where I think foreign policy meets the voter is on the economy, and that's why I think it's going to be very difficult through Congress to get any trade deals done. It's just not. I mean, that's why you haven't been able to get TPP back. There's just an allergy to trade there. I just on the Trump question, I think it's very important to take into consideration what happens to leaders when they leave and they come back, and just take Hungary as an example. So I think Orban was much tamer his first time around, but then when they come back, they know where the bodies are buried. It was very clear that Trump was trying to win over the military, and it's very clear if you look at what the Heritage Foundation is trying to do by purging things, that he's not going to. And if you look at the people around him, he's not going to have those people around him that Fiona Hill, etc. That are going to be able to to contain him.
Yeah. The bulk of the questions on China went to you. So before you take them all, do you, Natalie and Alex, want to address the question about what the post-American Europe can look like, given the division between the Central Europeans and the Western Europeans? And, I presume the question was, do we need more strategy, less autonomy? I'm not sure whether that was the...
Well, I think we should see how things evolve, and they evolve quite rapidly. This so-called division between Central Europe and Western Europe is less relevant than it used to be. Right now, there are European trainers in Poland and Germany training Ukrainian military, and they come from many member states, and it was done very rapidly and at a level that was never tried before. The same with providing military equipment to Ukraine. Poland, Baltic states like Estonia are doing a huge effort, but they are doing this effort because there is German money, French money, refunding them for that. And that's very good. I mean, I support it. There's a lot of solidarity. So this previous divide has been completely blurred by the war in Ukraine, where public opinions are united and are pushing most of the European leaders in a common direction, except Hungary with Orban, and maybe others in the coming month, which is a risk. As regards a post-American Europe, I'm not looking forward to it. But I have a sense that maybe Joe Biden is the last American president with strong European roots and strong European reflexes. If he wins re-election, it might only postpone the moment where a majority of Americans don't really care about what's taking place in Europe. And I don't like to say it. I'm not a gloating French saying it. I'm just trying to prepare us to something where we would not attract that much attention from Washington, and we are not prepared enough yet. Yes, there are strong new members of NATO like Finland, and it's incredibly important. But you are asking about Central Europe and France. Why don't you talk about the change in Germany? The Zeitenwende, the 100 billion euros that Germany is now ready to dedicate to defense. Do we fully realize the cultural revolution that it means? Are we talking about the UK, which was quite happy to leave the European Union until they found themselves in the middle of a pandemic and a war in Europe, and now they are trying not to rejoin Europe, but to have stronger links with the European Union. European political community is an opportunity to work together. We have much more to do, not against the United States, but in case we are not the center of attention.
Yeah, perhaps I can combine the idea of a post-American Europe with Wolfgang's question of, how do we make ourselves into an asset rather than a free rider. Of course, the term post-American world comes from Fareed Zakaria's book in the, mid-2005-6, around then. I kind of want to think that a post-American Europe is actually one where the geographic balance has shifted eastbound. I think that's what we're actually looking at the moment because of the war in Ukraine. I mean, Poland, with all due respect, wasn't exactly the favorite child of Brussels before the war began. But now, in many ways, it is. And, if you top that with the potential EU membership of Ukraine, which I think is going to have to be part of the peace package whenever it emerges, I think we're starting to see that shift. Now, what does make me happy that the Franco-German axis, which has been both the engine and the brake of European integration throughout its history, has done actually a fairly positive Zeitenwende. I mean, Germany, there was a bit of Zeitenslalom, right? I mean, it sort of takes a while to get the thing going. But if you look at the latest speeches, the latest statements and interviews, and actually Scholz in front of a crowd, which we probably... So you're seeing something big shifting here. It's much easier for countries like Finland, whose foreign and security policy hasn't always been about their own existence, to shift tack. But for a country like Germany, and to a certain extent a country like France, it's been difficult to do that. So I think there's a shift. Now, then we come to the question, how do we become an asset? I think there are really only two clear sort of takeaways from that. The first one is that we help Ukraine to win the war. And I actually think we've been doing quite well when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to financial aid, when it comes to military aid, and then, of course, when we see reconstruction as well. Because I think the point about schools and things, like, you're absolutely right. It's going to have to be. The other one is we need to do this enlargement thing. It's just as simple as that, because Americans will calm down when they say, okay, the Western Balkans are going in, Ukraine is going in, Moldova is going in, we got this thing settled. Not going to be easy, of course, but I think that's the way in which we placate the Americans, and they will see us as an asset rather than a liability.
Glad to hear your optimism.
Always.
Alex Wells-Green. Tough questions. I'm going to just take, we're actually at the limit of our time, but I'm going to take 2 minutes for that, or 3. Question from Asla was, are we creating a self-fulfilling prophecy? If I'm correct. There is no, her point was, there is really no evidence that China is intending to attack. And question from Wolfgang was, your usual primacist argument, which is we need to win in Ukraine to deter the invasion of Taiwan. They were both challenging you. Do you want to respond?
Absolutely, and I'll just add, just off the bat, piggyback on what Alex Soros said before. Personnel. President Trump, in many ways, had difficulty implementing his agenda, whether you agree with it or not, in large measure because there are a lot of divergences of views among the personnel within his administration. Another Trump administration, a DeSantis administration, could face similar problem, similar challenge. Places like the Heritage Foundation and others are working now to fix that by basically working preemptively to find folks who are capable, who are aligned, who can staff an administration and operate in a faithful manner. So that is something I think you should keep an eye on and could expect to change and have a meaningful impact on that administration's ability to execute. On the China question, the status quo is often upheld as sort of this ethereal being that sort of just exists. And if we just don't mess with it, it will persist. But the reality is the status quo in the Strait has been failing for many, many years. This is more than anything a result of, well, a few things. As China has grown more powerful and more able to seize Taiwan, that has necessarily imperiled the status quo, just by virtue of having the capability to invade and seize Taiwan. And and I would offer that's not really a matter of debate. I mean, it's been stated publicly that she has set 27 as the timeline for at least being able to take Taiwan. Ample public records showing that China is undergoing a historic military modernization expansion effort. There are hints that the publicly acknowledged figures for China's defense budget vastly understate what it is spending, even during periods of economic contraction. This is the kind of behavior you would expect from a state that intends to be militarily powerful and wants to do it quickly for a reason. And the reason, at a certain point, when someone says something, you should probably take them at the word. What has been said by Xi and others in Chinese leadership is that the Taiwan problem needs to be resolved. If it cannot be resolved without force, they reserve the right to use force, and it's not going to be resolved without force. There are no trends that suggest that Taiwan will unify with the mainland absent the use of military force by China. So this is sort of just a quick snapshot on the Taiwan problem. And from an American perspective, Beijing has been equally clear. The CCP leaders and officials over many years, most recently obviously with Xi, have been clear that they seek something like hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. That is not something that the United States should tolerate. It is not in our interest to see our chief rival dominate the world's largest and arguably most important market, among other things. So that's something we should head off. Taiwan is sort of the first step to that effect.
To Wolfgang's point, we need to win Ukraine to deter the
I've heard a lot of arguments about how, to Wolfgang's question, I've heard a lot of arguments about how, standing firm with Ukraine will demonstrate resolve and put fear into Beijing so they will be less inclined to invade Taiwan. I would submit that there are things that may be occurring in Ukraine that give Beijing reason to hesitate or to be perhaps more reluctant, or at least to do a little bit more prep before they pull the trigger on Taiwan. But these are things that, and this is sort of the core thesis here, these are things that cause Xi and others in that leadership chain to doubt their ability to do it successfully. This is deterrence by denial in a nutshell. Taiwan, Xi's decision on whether or not to invade Taiwan rests far less, and this is certainly my position, but this is a position that you will hear plenty of if you talk to folks working this issue in Washington, the Pentagon, or other places, depends far less on what happens in Ukraine and far more on his assessment of whether or not he can do it. Xi is far more likely to invade and take control of Taiwan if he believes he can do it, if he's confident that he can do it successfully, and there's no other way, regardless of whether Ukraine succeeds or fails. That's sort of the bottom line. Which means that from our standpoint, then, the best way to deter China is by emphasizing a strategy now in the Indo-Pacific to the degree that entails trade-offs with Ukraine, and it does. Then we must prioritize, and that's where the conversation about reallocation occurs. And then just the final point here on what Europe can do more. I would offer, and at risk of beating the drum repeatedly here, security burden sharing in the defense realm. Strongly support what Natalie was saying earlier, and just a couple quick thoughts just to round out. One, I wouldn't overstate the progress that Europe has seen thus far. I'm still waiting for the Zeitenwende to materialize, and I've had conversations with German officials over some time where the tone and the promises, I'll believe it when I see it. And oh, by the way, there's still more to be done. We had SACEUR General Cavoli when he was up for confirmation in the U.S. Senate, Senator Hawley rightfully asked him some tough questions about the Wales Pledge, about burden sharing the alliance, and General Cavoli, it took a little bit of persuasion, but he eventually stated publicly, for the record, that the Wales Pledge is obsolete and more is required to meet existing defense requirements. So there's much more to be done here. And the last thing I would say is if we can get to a place where Europe is taking primary responsibility for Europe's conventional defense, rely on the U.S. for a nuclear deterrent and select conventional forces, this not only will dramatically improve Europe's ability to secure itself across the future, regardless of what happens in the Pacific, I would also expect cascading benefits. You know, to the degree that Americans, including folks, you know, with whom I work, look to Europe and say, you know, the folks are serious, they're committed, they're investing, they're reliable in the security realm, then I would imagine it'd become a lot easier to work together on things in the economic realm and other areas as well.
Thank you very much. So Jana Pulgarin has a lot of work to do still to make the Zeitenwende slalom into the real Zeitenwende. I'd just like to thank one more time to our colleague Celia Berlin, who has been instrumental in making sure that this paper is produced without a major ethnic conflict between the American and the Bosnian. And to the great panel for all of your contributions. I'm glad to see your positivity and kind of optimism about Europe getting its act together and look forward, all of us working on it together. Thanks one more time.